Good morning, everyone. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I get into it. If you're wondering where the restrooms are, they're out the side door on my right, your left, just out in the hallway there. If you need them, please help yourselves. I'm going to talk about some consumer trends that are going on, but before I do that, let me just say a little bit about Cornell and our food industry management program. I'm here, of course, with a bunch of colleagues that you'll meet throughout the day. My name is Rod Hawks. I'm part of this food industry management group at Cornell in our Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management. We've done this, as Jim mentioned, this is the second year for this program, but we do a number of different executive education programs throughout the year, in addition to teaching students on our campus. We do a little bit of research. One of my colleagues, a few of our colleagues here today are involved in our research, and you're going to hear about some of that as well. With that, let me just talk about my topic for today. You won't find this in your notebooks. I'm going to keep an element of surprise, and we'll hand it out after the session. And one of the reasons is that there's a surprise here coming up. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that Jim was just alluding to. He was talking about it more from the industry perspective, where I'm going to talk about it from a consumer and retailer perspective. So consumer shifts and food industry responses. Since we are an academic institution, the first thing we're going to do is have a little quiz. Get everybody sharp the first thing in the morning. So here's your first question. What % of total store sales is the produce department? Here's the second question. Just write down your answers. What % of fresh fruit sales is random weight? This is at retail. What % of fresh vegetable sales is unbranded? Again, at retail. What % of fresh vegetable sales is private label? And the last question, what % of fresh produce retail sales is sold via supermarkets? So we give you the final exam right up front. All right, let's talk about answers. How about the first one? Who's got an answer? Yes, sir. 10%. Anyone else? Anyone else? You're very close. Just about 12%. Okay? How about the second question? Percent of fresh fruit that is sales that is random weight. Anyone? Somebody's got an answer. Be brave. Raise your hand. Do I have to call on someone? DeRigo family. Yes. Oh, in the back there. Sorry. 7%. You're a little on the low side. Anyone else? 20%. Still low. 62. 62% is sold random weight. How about question 3? What % of fresh vegetable sales is unbranded? Anyone? Call out a number. 60. Anybody else? 60's on the high side. Sorry? You said 30? You're closer, I think. 34.5%. You're going to get a gold star for today. That's 2 almost right. How about the next one? Percent of fresh vegetable sales that is private label. Don't be shy. Call out a number. 15%, you're very close. It's almost 19%, 18.5%, which is very close if you're familiar with the overall food industry percentage for private label is roughly the same as that. And the last one, what % of fresh produce is sold via supermarkets? DeRigo family? Brain Trust? 30, okay. Anyone else? That 30 is a low. 65 is very close. 60.5, okay. So, these are numbers, statistics about the industry. You're all professionals in the industry. I just wanted to give you something to get your brain engaged a little bit, and also give you some perspective on sort of the scale of things that we talk about in this industry. So as important as the supermarket channel is in retailing in general, only 60% of fresh fruits and vegetables are sold through supermarkets. So I want to shift now and look at this from a consumer's perspective. The food industry generally has a lot of issues, and I'm going to put up some of those here. They're in no order, and as I said, it's just a partial list. So just take a moment and look over this list. I'm sure for everyone in this room, there's, maybe for some of you, all of these issues are familiar. All of these resonate with you personally or professionally somehow. But there may be some up here that some of you are less familiar with, and maybe my own terminology here might not be the same way that you refer to them. So please raise your hand if you want me to clarify any of these issues. Yes, ma'am, please. Microbeads. So microbeads are not a direct issue in food, but they're sort of a derivative issue in food. They're an issue in consumer care products. So these are the small plastic beads that are used in products like facial scrubbers and toothpastes as abrasives. About a year ago, at the end of 2015, President Obama signed a law into effect to ban these. But there's a sunrise period of a couple of years where manufacturers have to get them out of their products. So we haven't seen them out of the products just yet. The issue is that these are so small that they are not, you brush your teeth, the toothpaste you use goes down the drain, that water flows to the wastewater treatment plant in your town. These beads are too small to get filtered out. They get out in the water system, the natural water system, the waterways. They get consumed by aquatic creatures. So they start to show up in shellfish. They start to show up in fish. And they also cause harm. They float. So these critters eat them. So that's an issue that's hopefully going to be disappearing, but we still have a giant issue with plastics in the oceans that are also out there disintegrating and getting very small as well. Yes, please. Yeah, food security A and B. So those are terms that I use. You don't see those in the industry. So food security A is the traditional sense of food security that we would talk about sort of in the world of ensuring that various populations have enough food calories to survive. We also talk in the US about food deserts in the context of healthy food, especially fresh fruits and vegetables being available in urban and rural areas where they don't have access to fresh fruits. So that's sort of that sense of food security. The second one, B, is sort of the way I think about the world since 9/11, and we're concerned about protecting the supply chain for food. That, as bad as 9/11 was, terrorists could do a lot more harm if they targeted a water system or a food system and impact a lot more people. Other ones? Other issues up there that I should clarify? So why do I put up all these issues? And certainly you can think of more. Up there on the upper left, I have obesity. I mean, there's a million problems that encapsulates, other issues that lead to obesity, and so on. Allergies, for example, huge range of issues there. But what I'm putting this up here for is that this is part of the calculus that American consumers are increasingly evaluating when they think about food choices. When we look at this list, there's always been a segment of American society, a very small segment going way back into the 1930s, you could think about it, of people who were concerned about these kinds of issues. These are the people who in the 50s and 60s started food co-ops. And some of those co-ops still exist and are thriving. But that was a movement to source food from directly and source food without a lot of ingredients. But what we're seeing, and what I think is very interesting in the food industry now, and a really big shift, Jim mentioned some of the shifts going on, but a really big shift, I think, is the way these kinds of issues, this broad palette of issues, is becoming in part of the consciousness of a broad base of American consumers. Okay? So we have all of these issues that people are hearing about and reading about, seeing on television, seeing a lot in social media. And so we're having this broader base awareness of these kinds of issues. So that societal context here is really important. Jim just was talking about the rise and impact of online shopping. But this broader context of the internet and social media is raising awareness of these issues. We also have had sort of historic levels in recent years of media coverage of the food industry and publications, books, movies, et cetera, about the food industry. And of course, lots of television about food channels and chef competitions and all kinds of things. Anthony Bourdain sort of travel programs. This environment gives small groups and individuals loud voices. And in this world of social media, the weighting of voices can be really equalized across a broad spectrum of perspectives. And you see this resulting in this sort of rising awareness of food-related issues and rising concern about them. But at the same time, we have understanding lagging that, right? It's not rising, understanding of the issues is not rising as fast as awareness and concern. And a lot of that is because we have both sources of great information and sources of great misinformation available equally, sort of equally weighted in the world of social media and the internet. So, in this environment, that causes a lot of confusion. We look at that broad spectrum of things that were on the previous slide, that's a lot of things to think about if I'm concerned about my own health or my family's health and balancing all those in my choices I make at a store. And often that confusion about what all these things are conflates many of them together. So I might confuse pesticides and hormones, for example. Sounds bad, they're both bad, maybe. I don't really understand which ones are which. It all sounds the same. I conflate those issues if I'm concerned and aware, but maybe not fully informed. Another part of societal context is we're aging. Aging baby boomers, changing the way they shop, and work, and so on. And at the same time, at the sort of maybe most of the people in the room's end of this perspective, the spectrum, is the rise of millennials and how you will shop and eat and so on. Jim mentioned some of the aspects of online shopping that I think are very, very true. And then the last sort of societal issue that I want to focus on a little bit today is this sort of stratification and polarization of our income structure in this country. We're just now beginning to see incomes for most Americans start to rebound after the recession officially ended over 6 years ago, 2010. Most of those benefits of the recovery have been accrued to the most wealthy Americans. So that disparity has really impacted how consumers shop. And there is this concern that perhaps frugality that's been established in that recessionary period and since will linger, much in the way that it did after the Depression. So that's a little bit of the context. Just for an example, here's some of the very many books, movies, some of them books and movies about the food industry that have been published in recent years, and some magazine articles. Their fortune you see up in the upper left. Some of you have probably seen some of these, read some of these. These are all about food, about the industry, none of them very complimentary of the food industry. Mostly talking about big food being bad, bad for us, processed food being bad. A lot of this bodes well for the produce industry because you're on the right side of these concerns. But again, we haven't seen produce consumption increasing as we'd like, right? We had, strive for 5 and all those things when, we never got to 5, when in fact the real goal should have been 9 to 13, right? So we still have a huge challenge and a huge opportunity for the produce industry. Of course, it's on the right side of all these concerns about the food industry. But all this publications, movies, et cetera, have really helped raise concerns about food and the food industry for consumers. I'm just going to show here some of the sort of organized perspectives on some of these issues. So you've got a bunch of organizations, again, that have a much greater and amplified voice related to certain issues that they're concerned about. So here are environmental issues, things like sustainability, pesticides, herbicides, et cetera, that the groups focused here with their logos, these are the major groups that focus on these kinds of issues. And some of these specific issues are not directly related to the produce industry, but I think that in the broader spectrum of this sea of confusion, they do impact the produce industry directly, indirectly. There's sort of a halo effect. There's concern about food, there's concern about the food industry, there's confusion about which of these issues affect which parts of the food industry. So where there's concern about any of these issues, even if they're not directly impacting produce, there's a confusion caused in consumers' minds. For example, here, one of these groups, the lower right there is the Environmental Working Group, and they publish, I'm sure you're all familiar with this list or these lists. This is their 2016 Dirty Dozen on the left and Clean 15 fruits and vegetables on the right. Everyone familiar with this? I won't go over it if you're not. Maybe not. So on the left are the Dirty Dozen. So they're concerned in this list about pesticide residue. So they're saying if you're going to buy strawberries, apples, nectarines, et cetera, you should buy them organic, okay? The ones on the right, in their tests, are low in pesticide residue, so they say you can buy them conventional or organic as you see fit. But if you're on that list on the left, which is a lot of big commodities, that's not good news. And especially if you're, for example, an apple producer in the Northeast US, where it's very difficult to grow organic apples on scale, that's not a good signal. And what happens is, they publish this list. It gets picked up by news media because it's sort of snappy. These titles are Dirty Dozen, Clean 15 are catchy. It picks up like dozens and dozens and dozens of bloggers, and they spread the word, they republish this. So it has a very broad impact on consumers' knowledge about fruits and vegetables. Another related group, or another group of issues is human rights issues. And we're seeing a huge upswelling of this in recent years, and a lot of action by some of these groups to put pressure on processors and others to improve working conditions for either domestic workers or workers in the countries from which products are sourced. And this is certainly an issue for the produce industry. Let's go back there. Immigration reform, as Jim was alluding to with the uncertainty about our new administration, this was obviously one of the biggest issues in the campaign. How that will play out and how that will impact the produce industry is a huge looming issue for the produce industry because we know how important labor issues are in the produce industry. Another group, animal welfare issues, again, not specifically directly related to produce, but again, there's a halo effect here that impacts the produce industry indirectly. The GMO debate. October 29th, the New York Times had this front page story. doubts about the promised bounty of genetically modified crops. And we think of the New York Times as the newspaper of record, so we expect them to have the best research articles. And immediately there was reaction from the sort of pro-GMO side of this. This one saying, why Danny Hakim's New York Times GMO expose misleads. And then this one, GMO crops attacked by knowledge-resistant New York Times journalist Danny Hakim. And then Yale professor calls New York Times Hakim GMO story a hack piece with a biased narrative. On the other side, of course, these are all in just the next day. The anti-GMO side, all thinking that the New York Times nailed the issue. So the scientific community is pretty clear on whether, on the efficacy and safety of GMO foods, but there's a raging debate, and again, the sides seem sort of equal when you see it played out in the media, and especially in social media. So this is, how consumers get confused about this. Most consumers, I don't think, can tell you what G, M, or O means, but they know that GMO must be bad. Okay, so that's sort of the world that we live in. This was an article in the Wall Street Journal just about a year ago, and it was interesting because this was about organic food processors feeling like non-GMO food processors were stealing their thunder, right? Because non-GMO, consumers are beginning to be trained as being good, but they're almost being confused as to which one is better, right? Organic or non-GMO. And we know that an organic cannot be GMO, so by definition it is non-GMO. But a non-GMO does not have to be organic, right? And then if you mix in, as Jim mentioned, local. For many consumers, local trumps both of those, even though the local supplier could be using all kinds of things that they probably wouldn't want to feed their family in producing that. And in this new world of FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, where many small producers will be exempt, it's an interesting time where we could think about that your local producer could be the most likely place for you to be acquiring contaminated product. So there's an interesting time that we're in with FSMA rising in terms of its implications for the food industry. So confusion reigns. And this was one survey that showed that more than half of consumers think it's easier to do your taxes than to figure out how to eat properly. And I think what's also happening is you're seeing an evolving, this is a Deloitte study from last year, an evolving sense of what drives consumer decisions. That's what I'm getting to here. And on the left part of this pie, I don't know if you can read that very well, the slide's a little fuzzy there, but you have the traditional things that retailers especially are very well equipped to respond to. Things like price and taste and convenience on the left half of that circle. But the right half is the evolving sort of calculus, health and wellness, safety, social impact, and experience. And those are complex, sort of amorphous things that keep changing as consumers learn more, they experience more, they travel perhaps, and that's all evolving. That's much tougher for retailers especially to stay in tune with and to be good at and respond to. And retailers are struggling with that sort of responding to evolving consumer needs. Whoops. We also have, from a consumer perspective, a changing definition of food safety. It's not just about foodborne illness and the potential contamination that might cause that. It's all these other things. So you have, clean and accurate labeling and clear information on ingredients and sourcing, so clean label, basically. And fewer ingredients and processing and so on for processed products, and nutritional content. So the consumers are expanding their definition of food safety to be not only about safe in terms of won't make me sick, but safe in terms of it's good for me. It's good for those who grew it and processed it, and it's good for me nutritionally as well as for my health. So a broader definition of food safety than we tend to think about food safety in the food industry itself. And then you have this sort of overlapping space between food safety, food transparency and health concerns that both have elements of food safety in their mix. So you see on the left, the food transparency piece, all these things about how the product is grown, where it's grown, who grows it, all those things. On the right, you see how is food impacting my health. We talked a few years back, you had this notion of nutraceuticals, sort of food as a probiotic, right? A probiotic approach or a pro-beneficial approach to your health. And people are really starting to shop more that way and think that way. And these two streams of consciousness overlap a lot, and one of the ways that they overlap is in the consumer's definition of what food safety means. And I mentioned this briefly. I'll mention it here briefly. In 8 years, 2016 to 2024, the proportion of the total US population that is 65 and over will reach over 17%. That is the percentage that Florida was in the last census in 2010. So we think of Florida as the oldest state in the country. In 8 years, the whole country will be as old as Florida. So that has huge implications for the food industry. One of the things that we see in people in their later years, their consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables actually declines, which is a scary prospect when you think of baby boomers, my group, getting into this age group and facing that prospect. One thing that we know about the aging population is that they are also staying in the workforce longer. And working, maybe second careers, often in the supermarket industry, for example. So this generation of rising senior citizens will probably be in better shape than their parents were physically, and probably healthier in many ways than their parents were, but also probably living longer. So we have to think about the product selection for consumers who are aging this way and living a long life after retirement. That process is going to involve a lot more smaller packs and maybe much more value-added produce. Before I move on, the other piece I mentioned is the millennials. I think we have the potential, and it's not too much of a stretch, and I'm talking directly to the folks in this room who are in this age group. This could be the first generation in many generations in the US for whom the economic prospects are not as good as your parents' generations were. So, for many of you, you're saddled with lots of debt, starting out your life with a lot of college debt, more than most people in my generation ever had as a mortgage. Many of you are starting out with as college debt, and you're facing, for example, housing prices in most markets that are astronomically high on a historical basis. So very difficult to sort of reestablish or establish on your own the sort of lifestyle that you enjoyed growing up as a child in your parents' generation. And this economizing behavior, it'll be interesting to see how the economy changes with the new administration if we actually do see the growth that they're planning. 4% growth would be quite remarkable. And if that is the case, if that trickles down and really benefits the average American, we might see this shift. But over the last, this is 2012 in orange and 2016 in blue. And you see that the top two things are all about saving money at the supermarket. It's gone down a little bit over the 4 years, but still almost 2/3 of people saying when they shop, it's about saving money. This trend is also key, especially in the produce industry. We saw in 2014 the first time that food away from home spending was a higher percentage of our income than food at home spending. Now, this includes, in the food away from home, includes supermarket prepared meals as well. So supermarkets are getting a piece of this. But we know that on the produce side of the business and on the food service side, there isn't quite nearly the variety of product sold in that side of the business as there is in the supermarket side, largely dominated by lettuce and tomatoes and so on. So let's talk, that's a consumer context. Let's talk about the supermarket or food industry context. Supermarket's a 1.5% business, a profit business. Oops. And that plays into everything. Jim talked about some of the issues going on with death by 1,000 cuts. When you're working from this seems to be going ahead by itself. When you're working from a very narrow margin, it's very difficult to take on competitors like that when many of your costs are fixed, especially in the short run. Not sure why the slides keep going ahead, but I'll try and keep them coming back. Jim talked about a shift from sellers to buyers, but what we see even more so is a shift of power originally from sort of processors, sellers, manufacturers, to retailers, now shifting to consumers. Consumers have all the power. Retailers are positioning themselves as buying agents for the consumers. I wonder, guys controlling the slides, is there a way to stop the slides from going ahead automatically? Seem to be jumping ahead on me. Yep, there it goes again. Thank you. And as Jim mentioned, I won't belabor this, food retailing is polarizing. So you have these specialists, you have discounters coming in and stealing the sort of thunder and competing with the traditional supermarket. And that's not all bad unless you're a traditional supermarket. That's good for consumers. We have the shifting balance of power toward consumers, as I said, intensifying retail competition. We have too much square footage. In the last 30 years, the average per capita square footage of retail space just in the supermarket format has more than doubled. So each of us have more than twice the square footage of supermarket choices in this country that we did before. Slides are going every which way now. As Jim mentioned, online shopping is rising. Jim's point about whether people will trust the online shopping for fresh and perishable things, I think he's absolutely right on that. More people feel better having someone like Fresh Direct tell them when that melon is ready, when that tomato is ripe. That is definitely an asset that those companies have, and it's how they're differentiating themselves because they have to be better in that way to succeed, and most of them are being better. Supply chain visibility and traceability is improving, but we have a lot of work to do there. That's obviously a huge challenge. Food safety concerns dominate. When we've been doing executive programs for decades, we used to ask people, in supermarket companies, what keeps you up at night? They'd always say Walmart. Walmart's keeping us up at night. What are we going to do? Last 10 years or so, everyone, food safety. Food safety. How do we prevent someone from getting sick from something we sold? And even if it's not their fault. In the processing side, large food processors are losing share to startup on-trend companies, but they're beginning to react as well. Since it seems to want to go to this slide, I'm going to jump to this slide. So this idea of supermarkets perceiving themselves and positioning themselves as buying agents for consumers is a big shift in their mentality. They've done all these things for a long time, but it's really where they're adding services and sort of customizing product mixes in response to consumers where we see the big shift. Deflation in the recent months has really been a challenge. Again, we have the 1.5% profit margin, and what you're seeing here in the dashed line is commodity prices. And you can see about 15 months ago it went negative. So we had deflation of commodity prices hitting the food industry. And the prediction is that this might continue through mid-May or June of 2017. So this is a nightmare scenario for the supermarket industry, again, because many of their costs are fixed in the short term. Labor, rent, et cetera, is all fixed in the relative short term. And if prices go down, if you're forced by competition to pass those price declines on, then you have top-line pressure on your sales and therefore your profit. Kroger is a remarkable success story. They've just announced their 52nd quarter of consecutive same-store sales increases. That's the blue line here. So the blue line for the industry, you can see when deflation happens, it's very hard to have same-store sales increases. So that's the holy grail for retailers. If I can grow the sales in a store that was open both years that I'm measuring, that's the holy grail. It's not that I'm adding stores, my total company sales are going up. That's good too. But how am I doing same store each year? Am I growing sales? In a competitive marketplace like this, if you're growing sales in the same store year after year, that means you're stealing business from competitors because it's just too competitive otherwise. So Kroger just announced this last week, their 52nd consecutive quarter, 13 years of doing this, remarkable record. But because of deflation, their sales increase, same-store sales increase was 0.1%, a tenth of a percent. It's the lowest it's been in those 13 years and directly related to deflation. And most retailers, public companies that have announced their results are all announcing low results, bad results, and also reducing their forecasts for the next quarter because of deflation. So a big issue in retailing right now. Said manufacturers are responding, processors. Who doesn't like a big burger? But this one is Impossible Foods. So it's completely plant-based burger. Lots of these products being developed. You can argue about how broadly accepted they'll be. But what's important about this is these companies are not targeting vegetarians. These companies are targeting the general population. The vegetarian market is too small. And many vegetarians would not want to have this. But their target is changing consumers. Consumers who are thinking about what they eat, the range of things they eat, and maybe doing the meatless Monday thing where they have one meal a week where they do not eat meat. This is very key for the the produce industry because obviously that involves them shifting and using sort of the my plate analogy of having half the plate in fruits and vegetables. Some other examples. I don't know if you've seen this as a little bit out of the produce industry, but this is Progresso. General Mills Progresso just launched a line of vegan soups under a slightly different brand here that they're using for these vegan soups. Purdue has just announced that all of their chicken will be antibiotic-free. And a little closer to home, another response is Love Beets, who was mentioned by Jim. They're taking a product that many people love, but many people hate to prepare because of the effort of transforming a beet into something you can eat. And they're a value-added produce item, taking a little CPG marketing approach into the produce aisle. Other companies have done this as well, but I think a great example of a value-added product for a product that's basically a superfood in terms of nutrition, taking that in. So a lot of food processors responding to consumer trends. None of these things mandated by legislation, right? Purdue is not responding to legislation that said take those antibiotics out of the chicken. Progresso is not responding to legislation that says we need to have vegan soups available for consumers. In the egg industry, we've just had a huge shift. Almost every retailer, restaurant, caterer, cruise line, airline has announced they're going to go to cage-free eggs. Not legislatively driven, consumer trend driven, okay? Industry responding. And in many cases, like the cage-free eggs, that's not a broad consumer trend. That's an effort of a small group of organizations to get that to happen. Consumers get on the bandwagon, but consumers didn't, it wasn't an upcry from a broad base of consumers for cage-free eggs, but the industry responded and did it. Lots of growth. We talked about 60% going through supermarkets. Of course, there's a lot of other outlets for produce, fresh produce. But the growth in both CSAs and the little pie charts there from 1,000 a few years ago to 6,200, and then farmers markets taking off throughout the 2000s, starting to level off there because every little town seems to have one now, in every neighborhood. But consumers wanting to be closer to their food. Jim talked about, whoops, went ahead again. Jim talked about sort of the structure and how that's changing in retailing. Here's sort of some of the companies that we're seeing do so much. The key thing is that so many of them are discount formats, be it Costco or Aldi or Lidl, who's rising now in the US. A company like even Trader Joe's, you could argue, is a discounter at sort of that end of the spectrum. We don't have up here Sprouts, I think, but Sprouts sort of a lower priced alternative to Whole Foods, and Sprouts, a company that has double the national percentage of produce sales in their stores, about 25%. You have a lot of, as Jim said, people nibbling at the edges of traditional retailing. And from a consumer's perspective, this is all good. Lots of options and lots of ways to shop. Retailers, as part of this, being an agent for the consumers, they've also responded by developing really sophisticated private label programs. Here you see Wegmans, Kroger, and Aldi, each of their organic offerings. And I think the proof is in the pudding that this is a broad-based trend when Aldi is so active in this. Aldi we tend to think of as attracting sort of a lower income spectrum of shoppers, but in fact their stores do much better in high income neighborhoods, and they're responding to that by offering products like these. And here's one that really caught me. This is Aldi coffee, fair trade, and single source. Okay? When you think of an Aldi environment with about 1,400 SKUs in the store, for them to make a choice like this is very strategic. They don't have a lot of flexibility. They can't shrink the number of facings. They have very few facings of anything. So if they bring something in, they're taking something out, or they're trying to figure out how to rejigger the assortment. So this is a company that's so sure of themselves. This is not a company that takes a lot of risks. This is a company that's so sure about this trend being broad-based that they're offering these kinds of products. Aldi's also one of the few companies that I know that has doubled the number of fresh fruit and vegetable SKUs in their stores in the last, say 5 or 6 years. They still don't have many, but they've doubled them. Ugly fruits and ugly vegetables. I have the title up there, No Good Deed Goes Unpunished. This is Giant Eagle, the Pittsburgh-based, really very good retailer, announced their produce with personality program on their Facebook site. This is March 1st. And I know you can't read those little things, but here's what they said. They said, do you know as much as 6 billion pounds of produce is thrown away each year? We're proud to help reduce waste with our Produce with Personality program. They're very happy. They're very proud of this. That's how it looks in store. Then the barrage of comments came. I'll just show you the first one. If it's thrown away, why is it not donated to food pantries across the country to feed the hungry? Instead, you sell it for profit. Something not right here. And I raise this just because here's something where perception and reality are mismatched, right? There's confusion about what's going on here. And first of all, it's a bigger story than what Giant Eagle said it was, right? Second of all, consumers are reacting thinking, they're just trying to make a buck. They're stealing from the food pantries to make a profit. And I looked at this again. I looked at their website just last week, and it just continues. This is a double edge for anyone to have a Facebook page or a website where you accept comments, because they're pretty unfiltered. And so as good as this effort was, as well developed as this program was, the social media buzz was all negative. And what a shame, because they really are trying to do something here that adds value for consumers, and it's being misinterpreted. So often, as I said, the message, the misinformation outweighs and sometimes counteracts the information and the good things that are being done. This is Giant Eagle Supermarkets based in Pittsburgh, operating in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia. The last thing that supermarkets are doing, they're really becoming more a resource for health and nutrition information. Many using, of course, Nuval and Guiding Stars and other nutritional information. Of course, fruits and vegetables tend to come out very highly rated on these things. But also like Hy-Vee stores in the Midwest, they've been very proactive in having on-site nutritionists and dietitians in their stores. I was just in Minnesota for Thanksgiving, where my daughter lives, and I went in the Hy-Vee store, and they've got an office, they've got signage all over the place, lots of resources, professionally, a college graduate, registered nutritionists and dietitians on site, providing resources, shopping tours, and so on. When companies first started this a few years ago, it was seen as just a cost, an added cost. How are we going to pay for this? What they've found is that this is such a resource for the community that they're driving business and paying for themselves. And they do school programs, et cetera. So it's really, and Hy-Vee's been big with it. They have over 230 stores and have over 200 stores with on-site dietitians and nutritionists. So just to finish up, just with some of the things we talked about. Awareness, concern, interest and concern is high, continue to grow, understanding lags. So the challenge is, how do you explain all this in a way that consumers can digest it and feel confident in their shopping? And that's an opportunity for the industry generally, and I think for those of you in the room. Traditional retailers are losing share, and future growth will be concentrated in the discount segment, broadly defined. Retailers are curating assortments to differentiate and appeal to consumers' demand. This is the idea of this being an agent and providing more services. Manufacturers and retailers are altering policies and practices where consumer sentiment on these issues is clear. I'll offer an example of this from the seafood industry. Last year, or maybe it was earlier this year, the FDA approved the sale of the genetically modified salmon, right? A year before that, more than a year before that for some companies, most major retailers, a year before the FDA approved it, announced that they would not sell it. Why did they do that? Because it was an issue where consumer sentiment was clear, okay? And relatively low risk for them, because Americans don't eat a lot of seafood. Having regular salmon is a safe bet. Okay, so retailers and manufacturers are changing their policies to respond to a lot of these issues that are rising in consumers' minds, like cage-free eggs. But they're doing it where they can play it safe. They don't want to be, retailers do not want to be a source of controversy for the consumers. Okay? Thank you very much. I don't know if I'm completely out of time. I think I am. But I might have time for a few questions. Questions? Yeah, please.
With retail being such a huge percentage of what's going on in the stores and stuff like that, how much of that percentage is going into food service?
Oh, okay. So the question is, if supermarkets are 60%, how much is going to food service? That's a good question. Jim, do you know the answer to that one?
It's difficult to say, but most sources maintain about 25%.
So 25% to food service, and the balance, which would be, what, 15%, would be roughly all the other retail outlets. Yeah? Thank you, Jim. Yes, please.
Going back to your chart on the dirty dozen.
Yes.
One of the things that's important to note in there is that each of those vegetables in that dirty dozen meet USDA standards.
Okay, great point. Thank you. Yeah, so the point, I don't know if you could hear, but the point up front is that on that dirty dozen list, each of those commodities meets the USDA standard for minimal pesticide residue. So thank you for pointing that out. Way in the back.
You talked earlier about deflation in the supermarket industry.
Yes.
That's not necessarily produce, am I correct?
Not necessarily produce, more in the ingredients, corn, soybeans, et cetera. Yeah. But it's, it's affecting the pricing across the board. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, there's a mic right there.
Yeah, the Produce with Personality program. There were so many misperceptions by the consumers. What were the missteps that they could have avoided, do you think? I mean, for other companies wanting to do this, what can they do better?
The initial company that introduced this was Intermarché in France a few years ago. And they approached it with a different approach. They launched it in stores by sampling product with consumers. And they actually made both sort of smoothies and soups. They offered the fresh product as well, but they convinced consumers by trying the products that the products were good. And as we know, working the industry, it's we've trained people to look for the perfect apple and the perfect peach, when in fact naturally the fruit comes in all shapes, and sometimes that other fruit is, if not as good, as tasty, maybe more so. But the other thing that they did was they fully explained what the sourcing was. I think that the confusion was here that with Giant Eagle that they didn't really explain in that little blurb about food waste. I mean, this is product that doesn't come to market. Now, this is product that doesn't get picked, for example. And you're just opening up another channel for product that doesn't meet the grade standards. So, I mean, that story wasn't told. That's a complicated story because many consumers don't know how product gets to market. And they only know the perfect apple or peach. So that's a more complicated story, but that's an important story to tell so it doesn't appear like it did there that you're going to steal from starving people. Okay? And I think managing social media is a huge challenge no matter what part of the industry you're in. And even if they did the best job you can imagine of explaining that, there still would be someone who comes on and starts that thread of negative information. There's a great video online, you can look it up, of the Intermarché experience, how they did it, and they produced a very good video of consumer reaction to it and so on. So you can Google that. Intermarché, Intermarché. It's the largest supermarket company in France. Other questions? Got a couple more minutes. Yes, please.
I was just thinking that, and you just mentioned, for instance, social media and how little voices end up to be big voices. And I was wondering if in your research, a lot of times we focus on the actual production and packaging and things like that. But have you seen any trends or interest in how the product is actually moving and what kind of impact a bad story, for instance, would have on the consumer perception?
A bad story like a food safety outbreak? Or?
Well, in regards specifically, for instance, transportation. I come from Salinas and I see all sorts of produce moving around in ways that I think if they only knew. And I just wonder what happens, if that got out. Would that affect, does the consumer drill down that deep into what's happening there?
Yeah, I don't think we're seeing the average consumer doing that. But the average consumer is becoming aware that the produce doesn't drop from the sky into the supermarket. And I think that's a lot of the interest in local that Jim was talking about. But I think that's where we're heading, where people are really beginning to think, well, you think of, again, the produce or the meat industry. Most American consumers did not know what a gestation crate was until they were banned, right? Or the industry rose up and basically banned them. So you know, if I learn that the pork that I ate for dinner last night was confined in a crate the mother of that pig was confined in a crate, well, that makes me think about whether I want to buy pork. If I learn that, you know, the truck sat on the dock in the desert transfer station for 12 hours unrefrigerated and my load of peaches or whatever it is, you know, that's going to make me think about buying peaches. And what I think is important is that story, you know, we would never have known. But, you know, someone driving on that interstate and seeing the truck with the peaches broken down, takes a picture, posts it on Facebook, everybody knows. It's instantaneous. And it could be one bad example of a very good company having a breakdown or whatever, but that taints a commodity and the industry quite a bit. So I think that sort of transparency is where we're heading. And that sort of a broader awareness of that whole supply chain, which is just not commonly known to most people. And for the average busy American lifestyle, who has time to be fully versed in what all those issues mean and which direction I should lean when I'm navigating a supermarket? Don't know what that was. But what I think we're going to see is something like, and there already are systems like this. There's a company, for example, called How Good. And they have a rating system that takes a matrix of like 72 factors across 12 categories of things, like how the animals were treated if it's a food product or, you know, meat product, or, you know, the environmental practices of the grower, and condenses them all down into sort of a traffic light system that's good, bad, you know, good, great, and not so good. So I think you're going to see that, just like these nutritional guidance systems, you're going to see some sort of everything together. Someone else has vetted this. You can be confident buying this one because it's got a great rating. So they claim, that company claims to have rated about 80,000, mostly packaged products. And, you know, they have a very broad matrix of things, much broader than that list of things that I had up there. I think there's about 40 things on that list, and theirs, I think, is 72. And I think that's what will happen. You'll have some sort of consolidation of all these issues into some simple rating system. So consumers just can't keep track of all those things and feel confident in making choices. So, thanks.